I've been reading books again.
Again, part 2.
Part 2, I know. If you've been listening for a while, you know that at the Transgender, we love to read books.
We do.
And this week has been incredible. It is Trans Readathon. As you're hearing this, Trans Readathon has already passed, but we are currently in it as we are recording. And it is an amazing time. It was
I've seen a little bit about this. No, I was just going to say, I've seen a little bit about this on social media. Tell me, what is this event?
Yeah, so it was created and organized by Sim Kern, a trans author, who proposed the idea of reading books, poems, and stories written by trans authors, and then donating, if you can, per chapter, per book, whatever, to trans advocacy or run organizations. Currently, this year, it's from March 20th to March 27th, but we wanted to give you some recommendations in case you wanted to do this sort of on your own time, because I think it's really cool reading books by trans authors and then being like, okay, every 5 chapters I read from a book, I'm going to donate $20 to a trans organization. I think that's dope.
I love that. It's super cool. And hey, the cool thing is you can read year-round. You don't have to wait until the end of March every year before you're allowed to read. Yeah, so here are a few of our recommendations. The first 3 here are online recommendations neither of us have read yet, but I think books that we wanted you all to know about. One that we hear a lot about from our friends with Trans Northland here is How to They Them by Stuart Getty. And it's a really cool looking book, and I actually do want to pick this one up. It's a graphic novel that looks at non-binary pronouns and the world of gender fluidity.
Stuart Getty is based in Minnesota, I believe.
Yeah.
And they are a super awesome person. I'm really excited to be working with them through Trans Northland. Go and check them out.
I love graphic novels too, especially like wild, like sketchy art graphic novel, which is exactly the style of this. I think that's super cool.
Yeah, in our planning meeting for Trans Day of Visibility, we actually had a giant stack of books from Stuart to have as a raffle giveaway, and all of us on the meeting were like, oh, maybe we should put our names into the raffle. And we were like, no, we should just go and buy them. Yes. Go and support Stuart.
Go and buy a copy. Boy, that's awfully generous of them to provide those books. Another book that was on the internet list that I was really intrigued by is Always the Almost by Edward Underhill. And I'm a big YA novel fan. I just have to say, some of the best reading I've ever done is in the YA category.
YA authors know how to craft a story without all the like blood and gore and like stupid shit that adult books have to have in them.
Adult-oriented books can just get a little tedious, and that's why a YA book, you can usually slam through it in a day or two. And this one, Always the Almost, features a trans man as the main character, and it's been described as a love letter to queer and trans joy. So it's this trans man working through some teenage relationship romance things, trying to find their identity, and it looks really good, and it's on my list. The other one that's on my list, I don't think either of us is a big horror fan, but I wanted to bring this one up because they are giving this book away for free for Trans Rights Readathon, which is super cool. It's called Bound in Flesh. It's an anthology of trans body horror stories by trans authors. And for all the books that we're talking about, but especially this one, we will have links in the episode description so that you can get to these books.
I also want to say, I'm not a huge horror fan. As a kid, I didn't even really read Goosebumps, but I am very interested in reading this book. Just from the brief snippets that we've kind of had of the like description, it sounds really interesting.
Really good. It's going to be interesting. What recommendations are on your lists?
Yeah, so the obvious ones, the ones that I've already talked about, the ones for our guest from today, as well as Dreadnought, amazing book by April Daniels. The other two that I wanted to mention, though, was Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars, a dangerous trans girl's confabulous memoir by Kai Chang Tom. This is a book that I actually need to borrow from Andre, my partner's library, because they really want me to read it.
It looks really cool.
I think it's supposed to be like a memoir, but it's like choose your own or like a fantasy memoir. I'm not entirely sure. It looks really awesome. And then The Black Tides of Heaven by Jay Yang. This book is super cool. If they had it at the library where I'm at, I would definitely pick it up and read it. But it is a society where you are raised genderless until you reach a certain age, and then you have a gender choosing ceremony. And I believe it follows 2 characters who I think might be twins, one of whom is a trans femme person, so AFAB or AMAB, and then a non-binary individual who is AFAB. And it looks super interesting about like how this non-binary person tries to maneuver in a world that is still gendered, but is more accepting of like non-binary people and genderless conceptions at birth, but not when you get into your adulthood.
That sounds super cool.
Yes, and I believe it follows Eastern Asian beliefs and kind of storylines and stuff, so I'm highly interested in this one.
Yeah, I'm interested in checking that out too. I have 2 books that I picked up at our local indie bookshop and have started both of them. I've not gotten through yet. The first is Before We Were Trans by Kit Hayam, which is the one that I was most excited to find because it really speaks to our particular interest area, which is the history of gender-expansive people. And it also goes across cultures in history. So it talks about all around the world how trans people have existed throughout the world. And it was really written and released with that specific intention of saying, hey, we've always been here. And it's a deep part of lots of cultural traditions around the world to have trans individuals, and I'm really liking that one. And then the other one is really close to home and is a hard read for me because it feels really like the story that you and I tell. But it's called A Girlhood, A Letter to My Transgender Daughter by Carolyn Hayes. And it is really just Carolyn's deep emotional journey in not knowing anything about what transgender meant to raising a transgender child who really came out at age 3. And so you get a lot of that journey with this author of an extremely emotional journey. And obviously that speaks to me because I have a similar experience with you.
Yeah, no, I kind of want to read that and get a sense for it, especially because that is the niche that we have. I don't know what to call our subsect of the internet, but yeah, no, I think that would be awesome, especially for some of our like cis parents to read and just feel like you are, feel that emotion and feel that connection. So go read trans stories, poems, books, and if you are able to and would like to, consider donating to trans organizations because we need your help now more than ever. Hi, I'm Anna, a transgender person.
And I'm Cam, your dad.
And this is The Transgender, a podcast chronicling my transition.
And a cisgender man learning how to support it.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to introduce everyone here today to Alina, right? Alina?
That's right. Yep.
Yes. Awesome. Alina Boyden, author of Stealing Thunder and Gifting Fire, two amazing books in the same series that features a trans woman, Razia. And it is, I cannot recommend it enough. It is amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Alina. I'm so excited.
I'm super happy to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
So we always ask the same question of our guests. So we're going to ask you, and that is, tell us everything about yourself.
Boy, that's a long topic, isn't it? Getting older and older, so it's like adding more pages every year. My name is Alina Boyden, and I do historical fencing as a hobby. So that is something about me, is I do enjoy fencing and have since I was about 12 or 13 when I started. And that was the first athletic sport that I didn't hate, I think, because it wasn't a team sport. And you see this a lot with trans women where you're stuck on a team sport with boys and you're like, oh, I don't know if sports are for me. Yeah. And then you go and do an individual sport. And so fencing was my individual sport. I've also done archery. I was women's world longbow champion in 2014.
That's incredible.
And yeah, so that was a while back now. That's almost 10 years ago. I'm old. But nonetheless, I did it totally stealth because archery is not always the most broad-minded of sports. There's a lot of redneck hunter crowd, shall we say. I don't mean to disparage anybody,
yes.
but it was one of those things
we
where
do acknowledge it exists.
I kept it firmly in the closet, and it worked out well. I also won a couple of national titles in longbow and some regional titles in longbow. And that's something that I really picked up as a late teenager kind of thing, and into my first job where I was training birds of prey for a living, but also teaching wilderness living skills and archery. So
this is amazing.
You are a fascinating human being.
Also, is this just a trans woman thing? I think this might just be a trans woman thing, like being interested and getting really good at weird sports like archery and fencing and wilderness survival skills. These are all skills that I have as a fellow trans woman. And I'm like, what is it that we're just drawn to these for?
I think there's an element of fantasy to those things. So I'm a fantasy novelist, and I grew up reading a lot of fantasy as a kid. And I think part of that attraction to fantasy for a lot of trans women is an escapism from a reality that you don't have a lot of control over. And so I think those sports also give you the chance to live out a little bit of a fantasy, a swashbuckling fantasy or a Robin Hood fantasy.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they give you like the ability to do a sport that you can do by yourself without having to be judged by a bunch of other people or on a team with a bunch of people who think you're not like them or something of that nature. So I think that there's something to that. I also just think, though, that frankly, fencing and archery are great, and anybody who doesn't like them has something wrong with them. So, yeah.
I think that's a fair viewpoint. Now, we're going to talk a lot about your books, but how much of that profession and training is in your books? I have yet to read them, although Anna's told me a lot about them. Are you incorporating a lot of fencing and archery into your fantasy novelizations?
So Razia never picks up a bow. Let me check. No, never picks up a bow.
Yeah, I don't think she does.
And only fights with a sword a couple of times in the whole series in both books. Most of the time, she's doing other things like using her brain to solve her problems rather than using a sword to solve her problems. Although she also has a Zahak, which is a kind of fantasy dragon creature, though I wrote Zahaks because I hate dragons. And always have, because they're aerodynamically implausible.
I love that.
I listened to another interview that you did on another podcast, and you talked about kind of the aerodynamics of a Zahak and how you thought about, what about a dragon, but more aerodynamically plausible.
Yeah, because let's be honest, I did the lift drag calculations on the Game of Thrones dragons, and not even with 4747 engines could that thing get off the ground, much less with wing muscles. I drew on living and, extant and extinct flying species from my Zahaks. Of course, there's fantasy. Some of them breathe fire and shoot lightning, and I don't think any extant animals have done that, electric eels and so forth aside. But yeah, so I think that for me, actually, the martial art that is in those books is fighter piloting. So I always wanted to be a fighter pilot when I was little. And I actually was in the beginnings of ROTC my freshman year of college to go be a fighter pilot. And then I transitioned and they were like, you are now mentally and morally defective. And I was like, that sucks. And so I spent a lot of time playing flight sims and met a friend playing flight sims who was a retired U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel. And we spent 6 months training it. And that was really cool to be able to experience that from him. And so that martial art is definitely in those books. Like all of that is in there with, I don't use modern terminology because I figured Azia wouldn't have access to the U.S. Air Force handbook.
That is insane. I can't imagine having a friend who's a fighter pilot and being like, hey, I want to be a fighter pilot, or I want to learn how to be a fighter pilot. And then just being like, yeah, I'll teach you. That's fine.
Yeah, I got to live my Iron Eagle dreams from the 80s with him. So that was really exciting.
That's awesome.
I love that.
Yeah, so Razia is a trans woman. And Alina, you are also a trans woman. How much of, and I think as a trans woman reader of this, I think I can answer this question, but how much of yourself did you put into Razia when you were writing her?
I think every character has aspects of me in them because I invented all of them. And not just aspects of me, but things that I think are cool or things that I think are mean. Like I really enjoyed writing Karim and Asma, even though they're objectively horrible people. But sometimes writing a horrible person is fun. I don't know. Sometimes you enjoy writing a horrible person.
That sounds cathartic in some ways.
I was going to say catharsis.
Just get it out on paper. People are evil in the world.
Yeah, you can get it out. You can write, I'm going to write the trashiest dumpster fire of a person I've ever written and just roll with it. With Razia, it's different because she was a culmination of a lot of things that I'd previously written. So Stealing Thunder, I think, was my 201st manuscript, probably. I had been writing for 15 or 17 years prior to that, and I'm quite prolific. I'm very fast at writing. I don't know if I'm really good at it, but I'm fast at it. And I'm on my third novel this year right now, actually.
Oh, wow.
That I'm just doing. Yeah, so I write pretty quickly, but Stealing Thunder was a culmination of a process of trying to write trans women as characters who are just really unapologetic about who they are. Like just absolutely whatever shame most trans women feel, and that I certainly felt growing up or was made to feel growing up. Just what if that was just axed out of that person and they were badass enough not to feel it, and then put that into the story. So I put that into Razia. I also put in, obviously, I really like her skills with military strategizing and some of the things that she's doing that are the more princely skills. But I put in a lot of skills I don't have. I can't dance to save my life. I am also not a trained courtesan. I don't think anybody would pay very much money for me, and I think it wouldn't pan out. I might buy a book of mine or something, but it's a different animal. So obviously there's a lot in there that is fantastical and romantic and not like me at all.
I love that. And what brought you to fantasy writing? You have this extraordinary background of world competition and fighter piloting, but what made you decide to start writing that 17 years ago or whenever you did?
I think I liked fantasy, and I still love fantasy because it enables me to play with my two favorite things, which are history and anthropology. It enables me to look at alternate possibilities for the way the world could have shaken out, look at what didn't happen rather than what did. If we changed something about the world, something like there were suddenly these flying creatures you could ride that had a lot of military power, what would the world look like as a result of that? How would that change politics and how people behave? How would that have other kinds of ramifications? Right now, I'm writing a mermaid book of all things, and it's super fun because I'm like, okay, mermaids are dumb. They could never happen. It's ridiculous. A half person, half whatever. I chose half mammalian, not half fish, because like half fish is just ludicrous. But okay, they don't make a lot of sense. It's not evolutionarily that hydrodynamic, much like a dragon. But if we accept that possibility of a mermaid, how do they solve the problems that all of us have to solve, which is I don't want to be cold and miserable all the time. I don't want to be hungry all the time. I don't want to not have a place that feels safe to go to sleep in. So how do you create a society that has homes and clothes and food? And do you cook the food? And if you do, how do you cook it? And then you have a wealth of answers in the depths of human history and knowledge and in ethnography. And you can look and say, how did other people in similar circumstances, say coastal environments, solve it all around the world? And how did that change? And how might that be adapted to an undersea environment? And then I get to write something that is a fun story, and I get to plug in about 5% of the world building that I did. Because if I plugged in all the world building that I like to do, because I really enjoy that, no one would ever want to read the book. It would be like a Wikipedia page for something that doesn't exist. So it wouldn't be very fun.
I mean, I just think of like Tolkien and how like he wrote so much backstory to all of this, and we still enjoy those stories today. But you can enjoy Lord of the Rings without knowing really anything about the entire world.
I'm be honest, I don't even really like Tolkien. No, that's
fair.
heresy. But I feel like it's like reading a history book about a place that doesn't exist. And so I'm like, cool.
Yeah, it kind of gets away from
I
that
always compare
fantasy.
the Silmarillion.
Oh, go ahead, Cam. Sorry.
That's okay. I always compare the Silmarillion to the Bible, and then Zulvafor begot Elefin, and they. And I'm just like, it's fine for a lot of people, but it sounds like you put a lot of your experience into these books, but you also have a varied interest, especially this idea of history and anthropology. What brought you there? Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. You talked about some early college experience. Like, what are you drawing from in your life that's gotten you to this level of writing that you're in?
I think the main thing is stubbornness, probably, is what gets you to the high level of writing.
Yes.
Like, I think that's stubbornness and good fortune, basically, because you can be a good writer and nobody will buy your book. And that's a fact. And you have to accept that fact going out. Because I think a lot of people who are listening to this, probably a lot of people who talk about writing, want to be writers themselves and they want to get published. And I would say that it's both exciting and cool to get published and also like heart-wrenchingly, soul-crushingly difficult. Like, not the process of getting published. Actually, getting rejected by a bunch of people, that sucks, but it's not that bad. What's real bad is when you're like, oh God, I got the career that I wanted. How do I now perform to the level I need to guarantee that I don't lose it? Mm-hmm. If you think you're anxious about sending your work to an agent, forget about it. The anxiety is just getting started. So I would say publication is something that a lot of people take as like their goal. And that's fine. But if you want to get published, that's not necessarily the same thing as writing what you love or writing a good book. And everybody's advice is write what you love. And that's how you get the path to publication. And that's true of everybody who's currently published. That's a survivorship bias. There's lots of people who write what they love and will never get published because what they love is not marketable or interesting to the vast majority of people. That's just a fact of life. And so I would say write what you love and enjoy writing it. But if your goal is publication, realize that what you love had better also align with the business needs of publishing companies and agencies. And if they don't, it's not going to work. And that's I think, the first step. So for me, I really enjoyed writing, and I submitted things to agents because I think I had this notion that I wanted to get published. And I think especially at first, I thought to myself, how hard can it be? So this was back in, 2003. And I thought, oh, how hard could it be? Let's go ahead and give this a try. I wrote something and I was like, oh, this novel turned into 180,000 words and it's not done yet. And it also has 3 plots and doesn't make sense. So then I was like, let's bin that and try again. Let's bin that and try again. Let's try again. 2006 rolled around and I was like, oh, I finished a novel. I'll submit that. And everybody's no, thank you. And so then I kept trying, and I entered a contest for Wizards of the Coast to get published back when that was a thing. They were going to do their own imprint, and I got through the first call, and then the second call, they were like, nah, we're good. And so that was discouraging, and I was like, oh no, I was so close. I wasn't really that close. And that was probably 2009, and then I kept writing, and then in 2013, I ended up going to grad school, and that was really stimulating and interesting at first, but then also grad school is oppressive and abusive if you've never done it. So then I was like, I'm writing basically escape letters from grad school is what my novels became at that point. That was like oh, please, God, get me out of here. Can I get a lottery ticket to get me out of grad school? And so I was submitting books and they weren't succeeding either. And so I just gave up on submitting things. And I wrote Stealing Thunder. And I got to the last third of it. Like I got 2/3 of it done. And I was like, this is crap. And I threw it away and just left it on my hard drive to rot. And then about 6 months later, I showed it to a friend and she was like, what are you doing? Why haven't you finished this book? And I was like, I didn't think it was any good. And she's like, it's really good. You should finish it. And I was like, that's just materially not going to happen because I never finish books that I've given up on. But I basically looked at it and set myself a deadline of let's just send it to an agent. And the agent, if she requests a partial, I'll finish it. And if she doesn't, I won't. So I sent it to an agent and the agent was like, I'd like to see the full. And I was like, oh, crap. I was expecting a partial. So I don't have a full. So then I thought to myself, I'll finish it. So I finished the book in one day.
Wow.
And then I sent that. And she ended up not taking it, which was fine. Yeah, I wrote the last 30,000 words of Stealing Thunder in one day. I feel like I can say that and admit it, and it's fine.
That is incredible.
You already admitted to being a typewriter.
Like I said, I didn't say I was good. I said I was fast. So, yeah. When I'm drafting, I can easily write 10 to 20K a day. And on an exceptional day, 30 or 40. Sometimes that turns out well for me, and sometimes it doesn't. But it does mean you have to have a decent editorial process. So I did that, and I was like, meh. Nobody really wants it anyway because this one person didn't want it. And I sent it to other people and some of my other trans women friends in India and Pakistan and places. And they were like, we absolutely love this book. Why aren't you trying to get it published? And I said, okay, maybe I will then. And so then I sent it out to another round of agents and I ended up getting my agent and ended up getting it published, which I was not expecting in the slightest. I think it got picked up. The final contract was signed like December of 2018. The book didn't release until May 2020, which was a hot mess because of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But December 2018 was when we signed the contract, I believe. And at that point, I had been trying to write for publication for about 16 years with no success. So it's one of those things where if you're the kind of person who carries on in spite of 16 years of rejection, you'll probably eventually get there. You'll probably eventually write one thing that people like enough that they want to read it and that it gets published. But it's, again, not guaranteed. And there's luck involved and there's timing involved and there's a whole host of things that are completely outside of your control. That's my advice to people who want to write is, do it, absolutely. But I will tell you that as much as I love getting published and as much as it was really cool and as much as it was incredible to, for a brief time anyway, see my books in bookstores, I would say that like having one genuine friend read my work and really love it means more to my heart than the publication process. And I think the only way the publication process really gives itself to me in a moral way is when I get people who read it and they're like, I loved your book. And it meant so much to me. It touched me in a way that I had never been touched before. That sounds really wrong. And that's why I said it that way. Anyway, but yeah.
I was just about to say, and then come on our podcast because we love your book so much. But then you said that and I was like,
yeah. So there's that. But basically, really just to have, especially trans women tell me, I've never read a book where I related to the main character in my life. And that was my story, right? Part of the reason I took up writing is I think I don't like reading that much. I loved reading growing up. But every time I was reading, I always came to the book like sideways. I don't know how else to describe it, but I feel like most cishet people are used to reading a book where the main character is like them and they can identify with that person and it feels like they could be in the story. And every time I read it, it's like orthogonal. It's like anytime I read those books, it's not someone like me. It's not someone with a life history like mine. I have to selectively alter my own life history to fit those characters that are mainstream and that are popular. And I never see anyone like myself in any of these stories. And so I started writing ones that come from me, and coming from me, I relate to those characters. And it's nice when other people relate to them too. Obviously, that's very validating. But I think that for trans women in particular, we may have grown up, depending on how old we are, never having seen another trans woman in media or fiction in any meaningful way for the entirety of our lives. And it's one of those things where I think about that and I cannot imagine how amazing it must feel to be like a cishet white man, where like almost every single character in every single major commercial piece of fiction is about me. Like, what a power trip that must be. That's got to feel great. I don't know. That's got to be incredible.
And I'm finding it boring now as that cis white man. I'm like, I want to read stuff about other people because I've heard enough about me out in the world.
You know, Alina, I really resonate with what you're saying, kind of coming at it from I don't like, this doesn't really fit me. I finished Stealing Thunder in probably 6 hours in a single day. I just sat down and I started reading it and I was like, this is me. I need to finish this now. And even from not even just the trans aspect, but throughout the book, quick trigger warning for anybody who might be listening, sexual violence. But even throughout the book, Razia describes and has to go through PTSD regarding a rape and a lot of sexual violence that has occurred to her, one being a trans woman, which, is not a great existence for how people treat us. But then she also like being a courtesan and how her life has kind of been directed by that. It spoke to me on so many different levels in ways that no other piece of fantasy fiction or really anything ever has spoken to me. And so I resonate with that so much.
Wow, that means a lot to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. And Razia is a courtesan. I did cultural anthropology work in India and in Pakistan on trans women's civil rights activism. And I remember asking a friend of mine in Pakistan, I said, do you know any trans women in Pakistan who are not sex workers? And she said, no.
Yeah.
Not one. And that's not to say that's the literal truth, right? That's not to say that's 100%, because I don't think 100% ever works for anything ever.
Right.
But it is an interesting statement in its own context about what the ramifications of transitioning are in that context. But also, we don't need to go to India or Pakistan to find that same narrative, because trans women as sex workers in North America has been a long-standing tradition. And in fact, it's been a long-standing tradition in Europe as well, with one of the first recorded trans women in history that we have is Eleanor Reichener from 1395 in London, who has an arrest record for being, quote unquote, a man in women's clothes calling herself Eleanor, who was doing that detestable, unmentionable, and ignominious vice with dudes in back alleys in London, including monks, because, quote unquote, they paid better.
I had heard a lot of that story, but that particular note is one that's new to me. That was fantastic.
That's in the case. Asked why? Because they paid better.
That's insane.
Oh.
So we know that trans women as sex workers is a trope, right? And we've seen that trope carried out and perpetrated against us. But I thought to myself, like, and it's fair because I've heard a lot of trans women online complain, I don't want to hear any more about trans women sex workers. And I want to see fiction where we're not just sex workers and da-da. And I think that's fair. And I think that's a reasonable thing to do. But I was looking at, in some ways, the bleak reality of what it is to be a trans woman in a pre-modern society in most contexts. Mm-hmm. And it can be pretty bleak. It can be pretty hard. There's a lot of loss of status that comes with it. We lose that status in America today. So in America today, trans women are more likely than any other group to make less than $25,000 a year in income. Trans women face epidemic levels of poverty. They are much more likely to participate in sex work. And we talk about that being true of trans women of color, but it's actually true of white trans women as well. Right. And so there's statistics to show that trans women, even now in modern America, still have a kind of stigma that often leads to survival sex work. So it's one of those situations where I feel like fiction has to tell the truth. And what I wanted to do with Stealing Thunder and Gifting Fire was to tell the truth, but I don't think the whole truth is, we're these oppressed people with no agency who are forced into these destitute circumstances with no way out, and we're helpless and we're destined to die of HIV or something. I think what I was going for was a different truth, which is that being trans can be really hard, and it can mean giving up a lot of things like sources of power or privilege that you may have otherwise enjoyed if you weren't trans, and it can lead to violence against you. But at the same time, there's room for us to be heroic and to change things and to have agency and to make something of our lives and make of our lives what we want to make of them. And so I think that was the message that I was going for.
I mean, Razia goes from being a prince of the most potentially powerful kingdom in this entire world to using terminology that might be outdated and wrong, but it's kind of what we have, to being a whore on the street, to then rising up through different ranks, struggling and fighting to keep raising her own status level and the status level of her sisters, who are not biological sisters, but found family. Something that we talk a lot about on this podcast is found family, to being a princess of the country she was from. That is incredible to see that, because I think that really is the more of a truth than the, we're trans women, we have to do sex work to survive, or, things like that. Like, no. Sex work can be a part of a trans woman's journey in life, but it doesn't have to be. And also, it doesn't end there. We don't start at being a sex worker and end at being a sex worker in most cases. We start at being a sex worker because that's the position that we're thrown into, and we work our way up. I have plenty of trans women friends who have done sex work, who are currently sex workers, and I also have plenty of trans women, and really any trans friends, who are in government positions, who are fighting for equal rights and trying to get trans women and trans people as a whole to that higher status where we don't need to fall down to sex work in almost 80% of the cases, I would say.
It's nice, too, that we live in a society where there's ways to do sex work that have a lot of agency to them. And thank goodness for that. They're really empowering ways to do sex work that I think some of our trans friends and family have chosen to do, because it gives them a source of income that might be more than that $25,000 cap, the trans tax. So that's what I hear a lot from this book, is like, it's even less about being a courtesan and more about, what did I need to do in order to live my identity, in order to gain agency and power, and whatever that thing is that you have to do. There are so many struggles that you have to battle through to get yourself to a place where you're going to be more stable in your life. And one of those choices you might make along the way is to be a courtesan, so that you have agency and power and income through that. So I appreciate that a lot.
This book, these two books, I should say, are a challenging and difficult read. I said that I read them in 6 hours, which is entirely true, at least Stealing Thunder, but that was not without taking breaks to cry, taking breaks to hurt and feel, because these are things that a lot of us feel and are struggling through. I would say the vast majority of trans people I know have some sort of PTSD, and a lot of that PTSD can come from sexual violence. And so I love these books, and I want people to read these books and to share these books, but I also really want people to be at a good place when they tackle these books. Alina, is there kind of a lens that you try? And I don't know if you go through and reread these books at all, but when you were writing them, is there that kind of like lens that you were trying to take a look at it, where I'm writing this for the betterment of my social group, but also I'm writing about really hard and dark things? How do I manage that?
Yeah. So I transitioned, 20 years ago now, just about. So it's been a really long time. And weirdly, it makes me like an elder in the community now. It's weird. I never thought of myself that way at the time that I did it, but I transitioned as a teenager, and it's been 20 years. And one thing that I've learned over the course of that is I have to manage my stressors and my triggers really carefully. So like, I know there's a raft of anti-trans legislation being passed right now across the US. I also know that I'm not in a good position to solve that problem right now. And so largely, I'm ignoring the news because I know it's going to hurt me, and I know I'm going to feel helpless about it, and I know that I'm not going to be able to solve that problem, but it's going to keep me up at night. And so I'm managing my stress. Sometimes I choose not to consume trans characters in media because it hits too close to home, or it's not a place where I want to be. Like, I don't write a lot of transition narratives, partly because it's so long ago now, I've forgotten what that was like. But also, I think I'm so far from the person I was when I did that, I'm not sure how much truth I would bring to that story. It's one of those things where I wrote more of those narratives when I was young and I had just done it. And now, all these years later, maybe I'll come to a place where I'm reflecting on it and I'll be able to write something meaningful about it at that time. But at this point, I feel very far removed from it. But also, consuming those stories bugs me a little bit because as somebody who's now so much older and wiser and has stripped away so much of the lie that kept me from transitioning even younger than I did, I don't have as much tolerance for the character going through those things. I'm like, pick it up and get it together.
Yeah.
Come on now.
Yep.
It's not that hard to figure out. You got this. What we choose to consume or not consume is going to be up to what we want or need in the moment. And I love it when people read my books and are emotionally affected by them in a positive way. But I'm certainly not going to tell somebody, hey, you want to work through your PTSD? Why don't you do the work by reading these fantasy novels? Yeah, that's not an answer to the problem. I think people need to be realistic about what they really want to consume and see and what they're comfortable consuming and seeing. But I think, too, if I had to say that there's a saving grace to all the darkness I throw in these books, because there is some darkness in there, there's hurt and there's pain in there, it's that I am not a French writer, so I try very much to strive for happy endings where possible, right? And like with Razia's story,
French or Russian?
That was some real shade.
Yeah. So
it doesn't always have to end depressingly,
I love French literature. But I do try to strive for, I'm like one of those like happy endings kind of people. And with Gifting Fire, is the ending happy? It's as happy as you're going to get.
Yeah.
Enjoy it. It's one of those things where you've been through a lot and maybe the happy ending is not everybody having the Ewok party on Endor, but I think that makes a difference. I don't like to read stories where people suffer needlessly, where the trauma is there and the suffering is there. And then it just feels like that the trauma was the point. For me, I think that what I'm doing with Razia in those books is she's working through those issues rather than being hit with them. Yes, she's suffering, but at the same time, she's overcoming and she's learning and she's adapting and she's growing and she's changing the world around her and she's forging her own destiny in a way. And so I think that aspect of it is something that I think is up to the individual reader, whether that makes it okay or not. But it's one of those things that for me is a mitigating factor in the darkness that shows up in books.
Yeah, well, and something that I think that we should focus on, as that's kind of the whole point of this podcast, is focusing on the positives. These books do have a lot of really positive things in them. For example, the catharsis of Razia blowing to smithereens these people who have hurt her and oppress her and make her feel like trash. That feels really validating and awesome as a reader. And you can really feel that in Razia's own voice throughout the novels. And so, yes, there's hard parts because that's the trans experience. So that's the writing experience. That's every experience on Earth. You're going to have those hard parts, unless maybe you were born a millionaire. But those hard parts are mixed in with this is a story that ends in a higher light than it starts. Razia isn't in the slums when the end of the book comes. So I think that's really important to look at too when we're talking about these books and just the general trans experience. You're never going to end up back down in the gutter at the end of the story, hopefully. You might end up going back down there at some point for something, but you've made it out before. And so I think that's really important.
You might have lost your keys. You never know.
Yeah, you might you might have lost your Zahawk down there. Got to go find it. So
that's right. I appreciate that you appreciate the scene that I had the most fun writing because my favorite scene that I wrote involved a swivel gun.
Yes. Oh, yes.
I'll leave it there.
It's my favorite scene. I was literally, we were talking about like all the things that Razia does and all of these amazing different things. And that scene is the one that I was like, that one's my favorite. I can't, it's too good of a moment. I'm not going to spoil it for anyone who wants to go and pick up this book. It's in Gifting Fire, so make it through Stealing Thunder first. But it is an amazing scene. We are kind of reaching the end point of the interview here. I just wanted to say, Alina, it has been a fantastic time talking with you. You are so incredible at the amount of things that you've done. And these books, I think, really show just a piece of how amazing and capable you are and trans women as a whole are. So thank you so much. And thank you for being on our show.
Oh, that means a ton. I didn't even get to talk about my lawsuit with the ACLU against the state of Wisconsin. We didn't even get there. So, shame.
We might need to have you back on to tell us about that.
You can look up Boyden v. Wisconsin. We won. The spoiler, we won.
Congratulations.
Yes.
That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
So one thing I want to ask you, though, before we wrap up is where can we find you and your work out there? Where should we send people to?
Sure. So my books are available basically everywhere. Amazon's the easiest way to do it. I know people have issues with the morality of Amazon, and we all do. So if you don't want to go to Amazon, pick one of the other, like an indie vendor. Anybody can get the books from Penguin Random House. And so they're easy to get. Stealing Thunder and Gifting Fire. We have an audiobook that was really beautifully narrated by Deepti Gupta. It was really fantastic to have her do the narration. I really appreciated it. And yeah, she just did a tremendous job. And so the audiobook's also available on Audible and in other places. Make your ethical consumption under capitalism how you will. In public libraries in a surprising number of cities in the US.
Yes.
And Canada, actually. Apparently, Canadians really like this book. So that's good to know. But yeah.
We have some Canadian listeners.
That's
so
where you can get them.
Go find it, Canadians.
That's right. Go Canadians. We'll all be you someday in probably 2 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome.
But yeah, so I'm online around, but I try not to utilize social media. But you know what? Anybody feel free. My DMs are open on Twitter and Instagram. You can just go and message me anytime you want. I have a website that I have never updated, but the form works to send an email to me, and you can email me through it. It's a terrible website. I'm not a web person, clearly. But you got links there, and you can always message me. And I'm pretty responsive. If you message me on something like Twitter or message me on Instagram. Don't message me. I hate Twitter.
Twitter is a dumpster
really
fire.
despise Twitter.
It's a
So
cesspool.
maybe it's horrible. If you want to talk to me, message me on Instagram. I think I'm Boyden Alina on Instagram because Alina Boyden was for some reason not available to me. And yeah, while I'm sending pictures of red pandas to my friends, I will come across your message and I'll be able to respond to it.
I love it.
This has been one of my favorite interviews. And honestly, Alina, these books meant so much to me while reading them. I actually got them from the library, and I really want to add them to my own personal library because they meant that much to me. So please go, support your local library, support local bookstores. I know locally we have a bookstore that I'm going to try and have order them so I can purchase them through them.
They should be able to do it. And if you want them signed at any point, you just let me know. You guys are in Minnesota?
Oh, thank you.
Man.
That is a lovely...
Yes, we are. We are in Minnesota, based out of Duluth. I know when we were talking, you said that you were from Wisconsin, and I was like, oh my gosh, whoa, we small world, it really is, especially in the US. So I just wanted to say again, Alina, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I couldn't have asked for a cooler interview.
Oh, well, I'm so glad that I performed and that the internet didn't suffer too badly here in Kansas.
If you have questions about transitioning or supporting someone who is transitioning and you'd like us to talk about it on the show, please shoot an email to questions@transgendapod.com, click the chat with us button on our website, or DM us. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a patron on our Patreon.
Shout out this week to Clara and Amy R., longtime patrons and friends of the podcast. Be sure to check out our episode descriptions for links to resources on today's topics, especially some of those book recommendations, and to go and check out Alina, an amazing guest. We are so happy to have had her on the podcast.
And thanks for listening. I've been Cam.
I've been Anna.
And this has been The Transgenda.
Love you all, except the bigots.